Hi, Sasha. How are you doing today, and where do I find you?
You find me in Sacramento after a 900-mile drive last night back from the Grand Tetons, where I was hiking for a week.
You did the 900-mile drive straight?
Me, my wife, and my daughter, who got her license a few months ago. The three of us divided up the drive, and it was a lot of fun, actually.
Excellent. How's your daughter's driving?
It's a work in progress. It's pretty good most of the time. You know, every so often on the highway at 80 miles an hour, we've got to do a corrective.
My first question for you today is, what possessed you to write a biography of a tennis player many people have never even heard of?
Obsession. And what I mean by that is for as long as I can remember, have been completely and utterly obsessed with the game of tennis. Both when I thought as a child that I'd be good enough to one day be a Wimbledon champion, and when I realized as a teenager I would never be good enough to be a tennis pro, but the obsession remained. And so whenever I'm back in England, I try and go to Wimbledon, and my son's inherited my obsession. So a couple of years ago, we went on a behind-the-scenes tour of Wimbledon after the tournament was over, and part of the tour included the museum. So we went down into the basement, we looked around, and there was a little exhibit on late 19th century tennis stars. And there was just enough about Lottie Dod, who I'd never heard of at the time, just enough about her to sort of pique my tennis interest, but I think more importantly, my journalistic interest, because it seemed to me it was a hidden story. And, you know, if you know any journalists, and I'm sure you know many of them, you know that we're always looking for kind of hidden stories that nobody's quite told before or nobody's dug deep enough into. And the Dodd story, you know, I just had to do a little scratching and my mind was blown by this woman's achievement.
What countries did your research take you to?
Well, obviously England, because she was born and raised and spent most of her life living in England, and, you know, first in the Midlands near Liverpool and then down in southern England. But she also spent a lot of time in continental Europe, especially when she was a younger woman and she was doing her various sporting things. So I spent quite a bit of time in Switzerland in archives where she wintered, and then quite a bit of time trying to follow her footsteps through central Norway, from Bergen through to the central plateaus and the glacial ranges in the center of the country. And then obviously the United States as well, because she came here and did some golfing tournaments, but secondarily because there's a lot of information about her in various sports archives. So those were the major places that I visited on my journeys.
Can you talk a little bit about Lottie Dod's tennis competitions against men?
Yeah, this was, to me, the single most fascinating thing about this woman's rather extraordinary career. You know, she starts playing tennis at the age of 11. That's when she first begins being written about by the British press. And that's in 1883. And she finishes her sporting career in 1908 at the London Olympics when she wins the silver medal in archery. So that's a 25-year period. And there's so many amazing things in that 25 years. But for me, the thing that leapt out at me was the summer of 1888. It was the summer that she was 16 years old. She'd won her second Wimbledon, and she challenges three of the leading male tennis players of her age to a series of tennis duels. You can call them battles of the sexes. This is 85 years before Billie Jean King against Bobby Riggs. And it's the high Victorian period. It's when women in public, when they're playing sports, have to wear ankle-length dresses with corsets underneath, all this equipment designed to constrain the body and make it sort of harder to run around. And Dodd is 16 and she's at the height of her game and she's beating every woman on the circuit. And so she's friends with three male players. One of them is called Harry Grove, and he's from London, but he's just won the Scottish Championships. And the other two are twins. They're the Renshaw twins, William and Ernest Renshaw. And they're the most famous sports figures, certainly tennis figures, of the 1880s. And William in particular was absolutely dominant. He won 7 Wimbledons. He won as many Wimbledons as Pete Sampras won, almost as many as Federer. And he was at the height of his game. He was in his mid-20s. He was just an absolutely toned athlete. So she challenges William and Ernest Renshaw, she challenges Harry Grove, and they do a series of exhibition matches in Northern England. And these matches were just accompanied by vast amounts of publicity. The media loved it. Thousands of fans descended on these tennis courts to watch the games. And they were billed as charity events with profits going to local hospitals. So, you know, what more could you want? You had the battle of the sexes, you had a good cause, you had the glamour, everything else. And the men thought it would be a gimmick. And so they gave her what was called a handicap, like golf has today. They thought she's the weaker player. She can start each game at 30 love up and we'll still beat her. So they started each game at 30 love up. And the first match was played between the 16-year-old Lottie and Ernest Renshaw, who she was a mixed doubles partner with. And he did win, but only just. He won by 7-5 in the third set. And the media sort of started paying a lot of attention at that point because this was more than just a curiosity. Suddenly here was a young girl who was challenging and staying level with the best male players. So she then goes on and plays Harry Grove, and she just wipes the floor with him. 2 sets, done, he's gone. Finally, she takes on William Renshaw. And this is not a man who's past his prime, like Bobby Riggs was in his 50s and, you know, out of shape and everything else. William Renshaw is at the peak of his condition. And she demolishes him. She absolutely wipes the floor with him. And the press, if you sort of can imagine a collective eyebrow raising of the London Fleet Street press, they couldn't believe what they had just seen. And they gave her the nickname, or she already had it, but from then on in, it stuck. Little Wonder. She was this wondrous teenage sensation. And that's the origin of the title of the book.
Did Lottie Dod have any interactions that you know of with the suffragettes?
Not directly. And I really wish she did. It was a holy grail I was looking for, because the thing is, when Lottie Dod was doing everything that she was doing, in the backdrop, you had this absolutely extraordinary social protest movement that was flowering in the 1890s, early 1900s, through to the World War I period, when eventually women are granted suffrage by an act of parliament. And these were not just small events. They were protests that could draw 100,000 people. They were protests that would ring parliament. Sometimes they got so violent that the Marines would be called out and the military would be called out against the women. And there were thousands of people who would be put in prison, and there were hunger strikers, and there were suffragettes who would very deliberately target sporting events because these were the public facilities that were so high profile. And so in the middle of the night, suffragettes would go to tennis arenas and horse racing stadiums and so on, and they'd firebomb them. They wouldn't do it to hurt individuals. They would do it to hurt property. But they'd firebomb them, and they'd leave suffragette literature around to say what they were doing and why. And I don't think Lottie Dod was ever involved in that, but she was certainly sympathetic to women's suffrage. She kept clippings in her scrapbooks about the legal rights of women and the absurdities of some of the legal restrictions on women and the ownership of property and so on. And the moment she could register to vote, what happened was in 1918, Parliament allowed women of property to vote. And she had property. She'd inherited money from her father, and she'd invested some of it in a house in Earl's Court in the centre of London. And so the minute that she could register to vote, we know, according to the Electoral Register, that she did. And so she certainly was very sympathetic to the idea of women's rights. And she certainly had no patience with anything resembling a glass ceiling. Whenever there was a glass ceiling there, she'd go basically and butt her head against it and make sure she smashed it to smithereens. And so she would take the male ice skating tests in St. Moritz because she didn't want to be limited to the female ice skating tests. And she was told that no women could toboggan down the Cresta Run in St. Moritz because it was the most dangerous toboggan course on earth, and women were guaranteed to hurt themselves. And so she got her friend, who was one of the top tobogganists in the world, she got her friend to train her. And after months of training, sure enough, she went down the toboggan run, only woman in the 1890s to do so.
What is the biggest unanswered question left over from your research into Lottie Dod?
You know, I think the biggest mystery was I could not find her burial site. She just vanishes.